Cool. My book is called A Small Man's England. It has just come out back in January, and it focuses on white working class English men questioning why so many have turned to the right or the far right in recent years and what the left can do about it. I think it's very important to talk about, largely because to avoid talking about it would be to assist the right and the far right. However, it is a taboo subject in a lot of conversations, and I'm fully aware of why, and for a lot of good reasons it can be considered a taboo subject. However, I think that any authentic socialist should not shy away from the issue, because I think socialism is completely incomplete without every demographic of the working class. Also, there's a whole British history of class struggle. One of the things that is central to British identity is a history and a common consciousness of class struggle. So it would be a shame to forget that, basically.
And yeah, so just to start the conversation here, Jason, it's that taboo subject, and there's the rub, isn't it? Why is it so difficult, do you think, for the I don't know, call it the middle class, the British establishment, the literary establishment, the chattering classes, call it what you will. Why do you think, Jason, it might be so difficult for them to tackle that kind of triple nexus of whiteness, working classness, and masculinity?
I think there's a massive concentration at the minute on the stuff like the Black Lives Matter movement, etc. People are becoming more and more conscious of the various mechanics of racism, how we've been sort of all indoctrinated into that system, and how essentially people of colour are getting it in the neck worse than anyone else. I think that is one of the things that the reasons why people are hesitant to talk about white working class males especially. But I would go as far to say that even I would be, but after reading that book, I found that it's definitely something that needs to be discussed, and you're quite right, Tommy, it can't be ignored or shied away from. I found it really interesting. I'd not looked into it before because I myself had come to resent people almost like that, in the sense of anybody that is right-leaning on my Facebook page or anyone that I know, I despise, And essentially, I think after reading the book, and I've had this creeping feeling for a while, it's wrong, you know what I mean? It can't just be a case of ignoring these people and denying them any kind of mouthpiece, or denying them any space to start some kind of a discussion, you know what I mean?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's lovely to hear. I think one of the things that I really admire about a lot of your music, Jason, is that absolute fury directed at the right wing and at the establishment, and it's absolutely right to have that there. I think it's just a case of getting over the fact of these people who are just normal people who are largely, they might be on the dole, or they're working poor 9-to-5 jobs without very much money. These people have been indoctrinated by a system which seeks to maintain power and has done for years and years and years, and will continue to do so without any discussion around it. And I think it's important also to highlight the fact that there is generally a sense of broader working class multiracial culture in the UK as well. That does exist, I would say. However, to ignore the fact that racial cultures are different and that white working class people are more likely to identify with English culture than a working class person of colour often, because English culture has been fed to us as purely white by the neoliberal elite, to ignore those differences would be ignorant, because it can be used against us to create division. But the aim would then be to acknowledge those differences, and then unite in solidarity against anyone that thinks we're daft and thinks that they can walk over us and switch up our opinions so quickly.
Yeah, I think I've never delved into it, and I don't know why. I mean, life just gets in the way a lot of the time. It's not out of any kind of laziness or ignorance or not wanting to learn. But no, I agree. In my experience, everybody that I know that attributes themselves to these ideologies are white. And that's just it. You know what I mean? It's definitely a social group that's there. But you're right. It's taboo, isn't it? I think with the middle classes, especially, they want to be seen as. I don't want to stereotype people, but you get the impression people want to be seen as all-knowing, all experienced in whatever field of oppression. And there's a lot, to a certain degree, there's a lot of white guilt as well, and it's overcoming that, I guess. But yeah, I agree totally. It's I found it really interesting marrying that with class consciousness, something that I didn't really understand the meaning of. Even reading those words in reviews for the band, I'm like, what does that mean? I've only really known what class consciousness means over the last 5 years, which really, I'm 50, what's all that about? So it rings true, white working class people especially, well, anyone, here we go again, you get worried about marginalising people or whatever, but, there is no education, there's nothing, there's no kind of portal to, critical thinking, as you've said in your book, it's now a middle class playground to a certain degree. It fucking easy is, you're not going to expect that kind of shit. In fact, was that your poem where you did? Was it something you've made up about the chat show? What was that chat show?
Jeremy Kyle.
Where at the end he just pulls out some fucking monologue from, I forgot who it was from, some philosopher.
George Orwell, and yeah.
Did you make that up?
Yeah, well, the section, yeah.
That's fucking brilliant, man. That was
really cheers, man.
That was really powerful, but that says it all, Imagine that. Imagine sitting there in a pub.
Just to contextualise that a little bit, so Tommy's book, it's an unusual book, which is one of the things that's so great about Repeater and Tarek's his kind of mission to put out works of literature that cross all these kind of boundaries and genres. And Tommy's book is really structured, part polemic and part essay, collection of essays, if you like, I guess, Tommy. And then punctuated with fictional, stylized outbreaks between chapters that actually kind of illustrate some of the stuff that you're talking about. Why did you make that decision, Tommy, to structure the book like that?
I wanted to lay it out in a way that was almost like a patchwork or a sense of a dreamscape, I suppose, because I think Britain as it stands, it is fragmented, and it always will be under neoliberalism. As Jason was saying about class consciousness has now been smashed apart, and what we now have is the rise of the individual, and the individual is all important, and I'll do well for myself, fuck you, everyone else attitude. That exists, and I don't think that a sort of linear, coherent narrative can be ascribed to England at the moment. It can only be represented as a series of discarded images, and I also think it's a dreamscape, because I think this idea of the small man's England, of the England that was great 50 years ago or so, say before Thatcher, is largely fabricated. and certainly in the post-war period, there was a lot more financial security, but there was still rampant poverty, and there was still, look at the miners' strikes, people weren't content, and we have a strange nostalgia in this country that Jason picked up a lot on as well, that sort of needs to be shaken out of us, or we need to rethink our notions of what England means as a whole and what Englishness is, because I always, whenever I think of England, I think of the working class, and I enjoy England partly for the memeiness of it, but also partly because I think the nation is the sum of the working class people, which is the majority of us, and it's not the sum of the 5% or the 1% that have all the political power. And until we sort of switch that up, we're just going to go around thinking, I hate Englishness, therefore I hate myself because I am English. I don't want to hate myself. I don't want to hate where I come from, but I do want to make it better.
A lot of the discussion around think categories like class and whiteness and blackness and otherness and belonging, a lot of the discourse around that has focused the last few years about these things being constructs. Jason, a question for you really, and I'm thinking really of the massive influence, particularly as a musician, the massive influence of black music on white working class English culture has always been a bit of a bee in my bonnet. What do you think this idea of whiteness being a construct, and that all these influences that we've taken, particularly from empire and from all those influences all around the world, particularly around music, what do you think of this idea that whiteness is as much of a construct as blackness in it and anything else, Jason?
In the sense of, you think it's, what do you mean in the sense of, what do you mean by construct? Sorry.
Well, I mean, a lot of the discussion these days has been about blackness being a construct and whiteness being a construct. Yeah. So yeah, there's skin colour and that apparently sometimes immutable. But as we know, there's so many lights and shades. And someone said to me a long time ago, there's a million shades of blackness. Gil Scott Heron said that to me a long time ago when I met him about my first job as a journalist, and it's stuck with me ever since. Right. Wow. And yeah, I mean, it's been downhill from there, right? No disrespect, Jason. Or
not taken, mate, not taken.
But it really, a serious point though, it really stuck with me in that, I mean, I grew up as a working class man in East London in the 70s and 80s as a boy. And we were saturated in black culture, saturated in blackness, saturated in the language, the tone, the clothes, music, the rhythms, the aesthetic of blackness. And yet, all of a sudden, everyone looks at me as a white working class male, and I find that constricted sometimes.
Yeah, very true, very true. It's fucking really hard, isn't it? Because we're in a climate at the minute where you can't say anything really, because it's not in your place to say anything. You want people of colour to say stuff about it. Your role in it, I guess, is to learn from it, to defend any anti-racist notions, and to speak up as much as you can and show support, I guess, as a white person. Fuck knows, it's really hard. I'm still grappling with it really badly, to the point where I don't say anything, to the point where I couldn't even promote Tommy's book online because I didn't know how to put the subject about the white working class, because as Tommy said at the start of this interview, it's taboo. Do you know what I mean? And, you're going to get people coming in and saying, well, this, well, that, because, as white people, we are obviously more privileged than people of colour. Without a doubt, without a fucking shadow of a doubt. You can just see it. You just walk outside now and you can see it, But that's where our hands are tied as white people, I think, because a lot more people now, particularly people of colour, are getting more of a consciousness about their history. It's becoming more and more apparent. So you are, for want of a better word, having to take a back foot. And you are having to nod your head and in agreement, because that is the right thing to do. Do I get wound up about the fact that I've, you know, I'm influenced by black music predominantly. Do I wear those influences on my sleeve? No, because I treat it with a bit of respect. I'm not going to try and act like someone from Tower Hamlets. I'm just not. Do you know what I mean? Or someone in a gang or whatever. I'm not going to do that because I am Jason Williamson, 50-year-old white man in a middle class area. You know what I mean? But I still try and use that creativity to fit to my individuality. So does it wind me up if I get cussed by people of colour? No, not at all. I'm still in a thing where it's like, what can I say, you know? I think we have to sit there and think, yeah, and quite fucking rightly so, you know. There's some rappers that don't even acknowledge you if you say hello to them online, and it's like, you can understand why, you know. There's that level of hatred and disdain, you know, for the way that our ancestors have treated their ancestors and put them in a place that they're in today. You know, you can understand that. So I don't know if I have anything on my, you know, if I have it, if I connect to any idea of feeling pissed off about, you know, probably being misjudged by people of colour or whiteness being a construct. I'm not sure, you know what I mean?
And Tommy, yeah, that made me think actually when Jason was saying there, are you prepared for blowback for discussing the things that you discuss?
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, it strikes me because this, as I say, this troubling trio of whiteness, maleness, and whiteness, Englishness, and masculinity. It is quite brave, I think, in a way, for a young writer to stick their head above the parapet and to actually start talking about these things, because it is a difficult environment out there in which to discuss these things. I champion you for doing that, but are you prepared for negative feedback and criticism and also misunderstanding?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's one of the main reasons that I felt this book should be my debut book, because it is controversial and you have to read the entirety of it to understand the whole argument. I feel like some people may not read the book, they may dismiss it on the cover or on the blurb, because there is reactionary books on white working class identity, if we call it that, which are out there. And I wholeheartedly distance myself from those books because some of these people are very thinly veiling what is blatant racism. But if we allow those sort of books to continue being published, then we're never going to get anywhere, really. We're not. I think you do need to take it on the chin that obviously the three of us do benefit from white privilege. White privilege is a very real thing, but then also whenever I mention the fact that white working class boys are the least academically achieving in the country, only just more likely to go to university than children from traveller communities, who vast majority aren't in school anyway, people are absolutely baffled and people wonder why. And I think that in the past, class was celebrated. As I said earlier, we've got this history of class consciousness and class warfare, but now that we are an individualistic society, it's very hard to put across the discussion on working class people who have been here for centuries and centuries and centuries, who are just, they're white, without sounding like a nativist. But again, if we don't address it, there's no hope of change, and there is more solidarity and more consciousness and more of an identity amongst people of colour in the country, because they have a shared sense of identity. As I said earlier, largely the working class have been shattered, and none more so, I think, from each other than the white working class. I mean, I take Jason's song Job Seeker, for instance. I remember talking to Jason about when he was working at the job centre himself, and then also when he's been to the job centre as a recipient of benefits. And like I said, one of the things that I really enjoy about Jason's work is that level of anger and fury that you can just connect to, which you do direct at people like job centre workers. And I remember thinking the same thing when I've gone to claim the dole. But at the same time, that person behind the desk is also working class most of the time. Most of the time, they're going back to a council house as well. Most of the time, they're there because that's the only job that they can get their hands on, and they may absolutely hate it. And that's what we've got when we separate people up, is this constant one-upmanship and this constant idea of that person's doing better than me. I need to now direct all my anger at them. And if we take into account the broad vision of what class is, you'll see that everyone that's putting each other down is largely the same class, and that's what we've become. And so while we're all attacking each other, there will be no solidarity, and socialism of any form or change of any form cannot be accomplished, I don't think.
So Jason, where do you see what you and the Sleaford Mods do in that discussion? Are you consciously activist?
No, not at all. I'm a fucking consumer, capitalist, you know. I own the means of my own production. Do you know what I mean? I'm not any of that whatsoever. But I've just carried on the tradition of talking about what I see around me, you know, regardless of what position of life I'm in, which is better than it was, you know what I mean? But I feel that I've got a right to do that because I spent so long working towards that. Now I'm at a point now where, you know, I'm not talking about shit jobs anymore, but I'm just talking about the world around me, and I've been able to acquire, you know, refine this skill of doing that and keep refining it. It's my trade, so to speak, you know. Yes, I'm completely aware of my situation, financial situation, and my status now, but I don't see why I should stop doing that. Do you know what I mean? As long as I'm not misleading anybody, as long as I'm not trying to be something that I'm not, I think there's no problem with that. You know what I mean? I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think Tommy's covered himself in the book, to be honest, because he talks about a white working class group as in relation to, from what I got anyway, to far right indoctrination, you know. And I think that is a really, really worthy, important topic to talk about. It's you know, it's very similar to the book Chavs, I thought, from Owen Jones to a certain degree. It's the only book I've read by Owen Jones, but you know, it really did open my eyes up to the question of it, and I think he's justified in talking about it. And if any flack comes back, then I think he's backed himself up enough to be able to justify the mechanics of the book, you know.
Mm-hmm. So, Tommy, in the book, you're very explicit about that you've got a vision for how things should be, or you would like them to be. I wonder if you could sort of summarise that. I mean, what is a way forward for from where we are now with this really divisive, identitarian, political landscape where working class people aren't aware of their own position. They're not really aware of much solidarity between them, and so they push against all the wrong people, which are other members of their own socio-economic class, basically. How confident are you that there could be a future that looks a bit more like you want it to be? That's a stupid question, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I am confident. I think it'll take a long time. I basically think there needs to be a DIY culture of collectivism, which is absolute solidarity with everybody in the same socio-economic situation as yourself. I think it should be DIY because I don't think it's going to be handed to us from above. If you look at people such as Jeremy Corbyn, say, we had the opportunity to elect somebody who has come from an authentic socialist standpoint, and we chose to not do that. And that's because we are a good 30, 35, 40 years into being a neoliberal country, and it's got to the point where we are electing neoliberals because that's all we know. So it's common sense. We'll just elect what we know. Change is scary, and therefore we can't hope to have change handed to us by a political party, I don't think. I think we need to build it ourselves, and it comes from building workers' cooperatives. It comes from having these sorts of conversations and breaking down any taboos and recognising that taboos are manufactured to divide us. And as far as masculinity goes, I think there needs to be a culture of brotherhood developed in which working class men, and of all races, but in this instance white, are looking after one another and becoming pillars of the community and directing their younger brothers, their sons, whoever, in the right direction, instead of continuing to push what people would now call toxic masculinity. I don't think masculinity is toxic. I think it's got lots and lots of different layers to it. It's very multifaceted, but it can be twisted to be toxic, and we're used to it like that. So it's just about tying up all those frayed edges of culture in general as a working class person on the whole, and realising and waking up to the fact that we're being done over.
Mm-hmm. Jason, do you feel like Tommy's vision has a chance of coming into fruition at all?
I think it's definitely an important point he makes. I think he's unapologetic. I think he's put it out there, and you really have got to give him that. Do you know what I mean? He's centering in this instance on white working class males. That's it. That's what he's centering on, and that's it. And the information in the book is good. It's direct. I think I was really, I don't know if impressed is the right word, but I was really taken by it. I like the fact he just isn't apologising about it and putting it out there. The book in no way supports in any shape or form the idea of being passive towards racism or nationalism, or this idea, or these ideas, right-wing ideas, regressive ideas. You just don't get that from it whatsoever, And so in that sense, it's a good book, I think,
I'm getting this remaining meeting time, 8 minutes, and it wants me to upgrade. I'm not going to do that. So when we run out, I'd like to just do an extra 15 minutes, if that's all right. We'll start another call, yeah? But what we're talking about, I think you bring an interesting point there, the masculinity thing. I mean, masculinity and mental health. Really, I feel like, I'm the father of 2 sons, right? They're 18 and 16. It's 17 today, actually. It's a really bad time to be a young man, right? You're in lockdown, but underneath that, as you identified in the early chapters of the book, Tom, since the 80s, the old certainties of working class life, the factory floor, the building site that's always there got a job at, the trade, the old certainties of the football club, the cricket club, the pub, these have all been fragmented and devalued over the years. And surely, isn't it, that I feel like if any change is going to come, all of us, and I think particularly white men, have got to start looking inside ourselves and actually changing ourselves to actually deal with these new conditions. And it's tough out there, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, like I was talking about education earlier, and this is part of the reason that white working class boys are still the worst achieving demographic at school, is because there was that expectation there that you'd go and work in the factory, you'd go work down the mine, you'd go and make money to bring it home to the family, and you'd leave school as an early teenager or whatever. And even though that world doesn't exist anymore, the idea of the man or the boy leaving school early and just getting into work straight away has still persisted. It still exists. A lot of white working class girls can be, encouraged to take part in education, and education by a lot of white working class people is seen as a sort of soft touch, and you're just going there to do it, but you're not going to get anything from it. So boys need to go out and work, and girls can enjoy their sort of education a little bit more. But, part of creating that culture of brotherhood amongst working class men in general, but also white working class men, is about changing that approach to schooling. And it's about not being just taught about Jack the Ripper and people like that when we're taught about working class history in Britain. History is a one-sided thing, and it's told by the elite, and so we'll study King Henry VIII and we'll study this, that and the third. We'll never study normal people or working class movements, even though there are instances in which we could do so. And I think that's where the drop-off point is that mixture between white working class boys thinking still that they've got to go out and work, and the fact that there is nothing to appeal to them in education at all.
Tom, I think you stopped recording. Can you press the record button again?
It still is.
Oh, right.
It said it stopped recording, and then it still says recording.
All right, okay. Jason, education, what was your experience of education, and how has it fed into what you do? Because, you're making these little, you're a storyteller, right? And you make music, and there's a groove, and you can dance to it, but it's also telling a story. Was your education in this country encouraging of that kind of creativity?
No, not really. Comprehensive school, I went to a state school, secondary school, really very poor in the sense of what you learned. As Tommy said, it was just stuff that you couldn't relate to, I think that's why everybody took to films like Quadrophenia and Eye for England and things like that, because it reminded them of their immediate environment, do you know what I mean? Especially with my mates anyway. And so no, it's crap. I got kicked out about 6 months before I was meant to leave anyway, told that I could sit an exam if I wanted, but probably wouldn't pass it. This is a type of, it didn't take a genius to realise what kind of environment it was, I wasn't very academic at the time anyway. I had trouble learning. In primary school, I'd be kept back for lessons and was told not to even bother applying to the grammar school to do the 11 plus. And so it wasn't until I left school, went to work in a factory for 1.5 years and thought, this is not fucking happening. And asked my mum if I could move back in with her. She allowed me to go to college. My stepfather was a successful builder. So, we lived quite a sort of, middle-class life. Do you know what I mean? It was, financially it was anyway. But I think that was the reason why I was allowed to go back, really. There was that freedom there because my old man, my stepdad, earned more money. And that's when I started to educate myself. When I started to learn about stuff that, again, I felt a bit alienated from. Playwrights like Bertolt Brecht, Artaud, very political people, but, still I felt quite alienated. Shakespeare, as Tommy mentions in the book, completely went over my head. Any Jacobean playwrights, you know what I mean? Forget it, you know what I mean? But it's only as I've got older that I've learned to appreciate stuff like that a bit more, I guess, but by training myself. But yeah, I was allowed to go back and do my GCSEs and A-levels from 17 onwards. And I think that gave me a little bit of a step up, if you know what I mean, intellectually speaking.
Yeah, so I just want to rewind a little bit. I always do think arse to front. a lot of the context, the opening chapters of your book, Tom, set a bit of context, and there's that real fulcrum moment in the history of this country, well, in a lot of different countries, and particularly in this country, and particularly for the working class in this country, was the 80s. And that's something that I think me and Jason had the I won't call it a pleasure, but the experience of being front and centre of. And you know, I can remember that sense of divisiveness. I don't know about you, Jason, that really came about. I mean, I left school in 1984, right in the middle of the miners' strike. Went straight onto a building site. And it was one of the few remaining unionised building sites in London, actually. It was a huge building site. And then, you know, we had NUM miners come down collecting money. And I can remember the sense of loathing there was. It's shameful when you think about it now. We were not consciously on the miners' side. I actually was, but the people around me. But I was that weird kid that, you know, reading Dostoevsky on the fucking scaffold, getting bricks thrown at me. For some reason, that was me. And, you know, I'd read The Guardian and get equally pilloried for reading The Guardian on the scaffold, you know. Do you remember that, Jason? What was your memory of that kind of that period, that early to mid 80s period?
Well, as regards to miners' strike, it didn't really touch Grantham because it wasn't a pit town. And I really didn't see any solidarity either in people's conversations. There could have been. I mean, it was so long ago. But my parents divorced in 1980. And my old man was a paramedic, trainee paramedic. My mum just part-time jobs. So we went from that to an environment, say, switch sort of 1982 onwards, where my stepdad, he was starting to become quite a successful builder. So you had this idea of individual gain, of being your own lord, so to speak, that hung over the house quite well. It was massively apparent, you know, this personal success of my stepdad, and you know, the luxuries that it bought. A bigger house. He was able to build his own house, and he did that in the middle of the estate. So all you saw really was just the estate houses anyway. And he had this house in the middle of it. And we'd get taunted at school for being posh, you know what I mean? And so you definitely had this Thatcher influence weaving through.
I mean, that was Grantham. You know, that was the actual belly of the beast.
Completely, yeah. But, you know, the ironic thing was that she was hated. You know, my stepdad especially remembers the hatred for her dad in the town was beyond, because he would say yes or no to people's livelihoods, basically. And what I mean by that is when he would control people's accounts at the fruit and veg shop. You know, if you weren't very good at paying it back, he'd strike you off the list, you know. And so you can see where she got it from. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, that was funny because he didn't see it. He didn't see it himself. But I don't want to demean my stepfather. Because he's a lovely man, you know what I mean, and he looked after us, and he didn't change. You know, he is by all purposes, personality-wise, very much a working class man, and will always be. You know, it just so happened that the system Thatcher created just worked out for him, and it did for working class people.
Well, it did. I mean, like East London, when in that period, you know. It was booming, you know. My old man was a builder as well, and you know we benefited. There was wall to wall work to be had. You could the first phase of Canary Wharf was basically built by my old man and his mates. You know, so there was so much work. I mean, you could walk off, you'd be on a building site, and you'd hear that down the road was paying £10 more a day, and everyone would just fuck off and go and get a job there. And so this created this divisiveness about, well, we're doing all right. I mean, we've got loads of money. Literally, that cliche of loads of money, wads of cash, that was my contemporaries. So we didn't have a lens that was natural on what was going on in those other parts of England, Tom. And I feel like And also, I feel like there is a danger, and I feel like there is this culture of entrepreneurialism in some of the working class, and that actually does get them out of a lot of shit situations. What do you think of that danger for holding that mass culture of the working class in nostalgia, Tom?
Well, the working class have always been, what's the word I'm looking for? They've been separated in their ambitions and in political opinion as well, of course. Like you say, there's always, there has been an entrepreneurial spirit amongst some people since the Industrial Revolution, when you were told that you could work your way up and get yourself out of being working class, and particularly since the 80s, when you can buy your own council house and essentially become middle class through that, or you become a landlord, you suddenly change your opinion on what money is and how to get money, because you no longer have to work for money. You can make somebody else work for money. It's the same as rising up through a business, and this is why it's so hard to pin down what working class means nowadays, because there's 1,000,001 people that are working class that hate the idea of being it and say, no, I'm not working class. No, I've got this nice bloody car. Sometimes I have like a fancy dinner, so I'm not working class. And then you've got plenty of people that are middle class that still say they're working class. Like, I remember in my book, I think it was on Question Time, there was a fella that said he was on about 100 grand a year, but he still thought that he was working class, and he refused to acknowledge the fact that he was in the top 10% of earners, I think it is, and he didn't work for that money. So it's such a weird mishmash of trying to figure out what class means nowadays, and looking back in time, as you say, Mike, there is definitely a nostalgia for a collectivism of working class people, because not many people escaped, or not many people could become middle class. Nowadays, still not many people do, but you're told to believe that you can become middle class, and therefore it's all messed up. So I think we can look back in, not nostalgia, but we can look back and recognise collectivism, and think how we can bring that up to the modern day without thinking, okay, everything was better back then, because in some ways it's always been the same.
I think the thing that really strikes me about working class culture, and the thing that actually I miss, I mean, I live a middle class life now. I'm one of those people, I earn all right money. I live in the country. I've got, my wife's a social worker. I'm a journalist. My kids essentially are middle class now, right? They are. I mean, but the thing that I miss about working class culture is the humour and the fun. It strikes me now that, and particularly because, like, we're not able to access like the pub and the football and particularly now, this last year, obviously, is a different case. But I feel there's this sliding away, and the middle class sort of, this kind of big mush middle class in the middle has lost the kind of irreverence and the creativity, actually, the punk attitude, the creativity, the do-it-yourself thing. Obviously, like, the punk movement itself was quite art school, actually. I've always thought it wasn't necessarily a working class culture, in its rank and file. But I miss that. I miss the good laugh that you had by identifying around an area, a football team, a pub, a place to go, a musical interest. I do miss that, and I feel like the devaluing of that, as you correctly identified, started in the 80s, has really reached fruition now. So even to talk about being working class is somehow seen as distasteful.
Yeah, very much so. But it's just, Tommy says, there's so many shades of it, so many, and it's kind of genius, really, isn't it? The way that it's kind of got a life of its own now. This divisiveness, it's taken on a life of its own almost. Quite fucking genius, really. I mean, it's the thing with the cunts, they're always 2 steps ahead of us, aren't they? You've got to learn how to be 2 steps ahead with them. We've got to learn to be neck and neck, and we're not. but yes, you're right. Yeah, I miss the humour, just the brashness and not caring for saying the right words. And I'm not talking about calling whatever somebody by the colour of the skin or calling a woman a slag or whatever, but you know, just that inventiveness. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think actually sometimes in my nostalgia for football, I miss that within football as well. You know, I miss it in all these different areas where, you know, like when I was front and centre when that first wave of rave culture happened, and that was a working class movement. That was led by the kids from the peripheries of all our cities, realising that fucking hell, you could do this, and it was something new that wasn't constrained by all those old certainties that you actually were constrained by. You were able, at the same time, you were able to earn a living by putting on raves and selling drugs. Let's face it. You were able to travel around the country having a laugh, and it didn't fit into any of those categories that you'd managed to get out of by, which are really constricting characters, saying, "Oh, you're gonna grow up, you're gonna go down the pit." And I know that from my northern friends. No one really aspired to going down the pit any more than I aspired to being an odd carrier. But it was a means to an end, right?
And this is a perfect breeding ground for division, isn't it? And blame, because nobody wants it. You know, I didn't want to stay where I was. Fuck all that. No way. I want nice things. You know what I mean? It's fucking really hard.
So Tom, the book's out now, right? Right now.
It is, yeah.
It is now. How is it? What's the process been like for you to be? I mean, have you suffered slings and arrows yet?
The only thing that I've had, and I suppose I should fingers crossed, touch wood when I say this, the only thing that I've had as so far is somebody on Twitter saying, "Don't you mean a small man's Britain instead of a small man's England?" So bearing that in mind, there's now that I've really had to defend myself from as of yet. It may well still come. But it was a great process. And I mean, it started off as a book about working class youth culture largely, but it was far too broad. And I wasn't really going in depth or saying anything new. So Repeater picked out or said you should pick out one specific thing and hammer in on that. So I came back and proposed it being about white working class men. And yeah, no, it's been a really good process ever since. There's been a lot of amazing people over at Repeater that have read it through and made their suggestions and added things on that I haven't thought about. It's been a learning process as well, and it's been fantastic.
And tough right now not to be able to do what you do and to read in public and to actually have a public forum. Jason, that must be something that obviously has been a lot said about that. How are you finding this not being able to tour your, because you had an album out a couple of months ago, right?
Yeah. Album of our career by all accounts. It's been really received well. Everyone thinks it's brilliant, you know, which is brilliant, obviously. But you want that lift, you want that live experience, don't you, to push it. Because to me, it's like it captures a time and place. All albums do, regardless of what the content is. And so therefore you need to grab that time and place and run with it, you know. And because we can't gig, we're not doing anything, you know what I mean? So it's almost like you're having to put that time and place on hold, as most bands are, you know, all bands actually. So be interesting to see how that one folds out. But, you know, the stuff on Spare Ribs, the content, you could apply it to any fucking time, really, apart from obviously the pandemic. You know, it just talks about various levels of oppression all of the time. You know, I find that really intriguing, interesting, not just from a working class perspective, but from a middle class perspective now, from just being a person, you know what I mean? So, yeah, that'll carry on, you know what I mean?
Just a kind of an aside, really. I'm interested in your, obviously, that, as I say, I've referred to your songs as little stories, and it strikes me they are storytellers. They are stories that you tell, and there's a groove as well. What's your process? Do you sit and do you come up with a catchy line, or a verse, or a melody, or what? Is that how it goes? How does it work?
Either one of those, really. A melody sometimes, a catchy line, a verse, two verses, a chorus. You know, any of that can kickstart a song, really. And most of the songs, they talk about various things, you know, but they're just one-liners in them that tell the story, the complete story, you know. That's how I kind of, most of my stories exist in one line, so to speak. That's what I wanted to say, I think, you know, as opposed to the whole song being dedicated to one subject. They're a mismatch of lots of subjects, because I think that's how my perception has certainly felt over the last 20 years, you know. I really can't pinpoint just one thing all of the time. It's just so many things coming in and out. And whether you believe them or not, whether you like them or not, they're just in and out all the time. You know, life moves fast, doesn't it? Late capitalism moves fast, so to speak. So I wanted to try and bring that over, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And Tom, Small Man's England, a polemic. You're a performance poet. You like getting out there and performing yourself. What's the difference in the writing process for you, for writing something that's going to be read out in front of a crowd? Hello. And
it's
and what's the difference between that process and writing prose and writing polemics? Is it much different for you?
Yeah, definitely. I started off doing purely spoken words, and that's what I sort of cut my teeth on in my late teens and so on and so forth. And that's all about sort of getting your message across in language that can be understood by anyone, and it focuses like lyrics on rhythm and melody and cadence and all that. And it took me, well, it didn't take me that long, but it took me a while to think, okay, now I want to hone in on writing for publication. And that's a whole different thing. You have to be a bit more subtle in terms of creative writing. You have to present your ideas in ways that will not necessarily hit home immediately, but may come back to sort of haunt the reader, if you like, just after they've finished the chapter. It's a whole different thing. You have to be a bit more surgical with it, I suppose. But I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it occurs to me, actually, if you're used to standing up in front of a stage, spitting out your bars, as it were, then the Twitter mob holds no fear for you. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I only became really active on Twitter probably since doing this book. But I mean, the spoken word community where I am in London is absolutely fantastic, and I think that's one of the places in the arts where you can really find a sense of community and solidarity as well. I think we should recognise where these communities do still exist, and a lot of it can be in the arts, particularly if you can't make much money from it, which is what a lot of spoken word people are like. It's hard to make money doing poetry.
Final question, really, because we've got so much good stuff there, and we've only got a sort of half-hour edit, so I'm worried to keep on blathering on too long. But it strikes me that we're both, all of us sitting here, are interested in working class culture, and we've all produced work that comments on that. What for you, if I was an alien coming from outer space and I wanted to look at one film or one book that summed up, that I could learn about the English working class, what would it be? You're not allowed to say your own work, obviously.
I mean, I'll always turn to This Is England. I think that sums it up nicely, and sets us off for what has become of the country since. I think that's perfectly presents the turning point in the country from this nostalgic or regressive vision of the old country to what we are in now, the late capitalism, as Jason was talking about. So yeah, This Is England.
God bless Shane Meadows, eh? It's
Definitely
a massive influence. How about you, Jason? What would you point to?
I don't know, really. Probably a collection of films. Again, going back to Shane Meadows, Dead Man's Shoes, just in the sense of aspects of working class culture. Fucking hell. I'm not great at being put on the spot. Do you know what I mean?
Sorry. Well, you know what? One of the things I always loved. Do you remember a thing called Meantime?
No.
It was a bit. I can never. I should be googling the shit out of it, but I'm not that sort of journalist. But Meantime was a thing with. It was with Gary, very young Gary Oldman. I think it was Gary Oldman. A very young Phil Daniels.
Yeah.
And a very young, Tim Roth.
Oh, okay.
And they were in it. It was one of those plays for today. It was a very late play for today in the early 80s.
I'll have to have a look at that.
It's really worth looking at, but it really captured that. And basically, the narrative was that inner city kids go and have to stay with their posher aunt out in Essex. And it's just that little tale. It's really worth looking at. But again, you know, I think, you know, people like Shane Meadows, and I don't know who directed Meantime, but there's not that many people doing that work, is there? These things aren't getting commissioned. Even in the absolute flood of content that things like Netflix and Amazon are hoovering up, you still don't get these working class stories, right?
No, you're tending now to get more kind of stylized versions, aren't you, to a certain degree? Or you're getting lots of stuff that centre on members of the elite, you know what I mean? There's lots of, you know, sort of series, episodes, your dramas that are based around wealthy families, around aristocracy. And, you know, don't get me wrong, some of these things I've watched and enjoyed, but, you know, you're not getting any Neil by Mouths anymore, are you? Or anything like that.
Oh, Neil by Mouth, fuck yeah, of course.
It's fantastic. And,
that's unbelievable.
It's kind of riddled in cliche.
Yeah. Neil by Mouth, I'd forgotten totally about that. Directed by Gary Oldman, right? Funny enough.
Yes, it was. Yeah, well, it's based on his childhood, wasn't it? But
yeah, and with Ray Winston, of course.
Yes.
In fact, I met Ray Winston. I interviewed him around the time that came out, and he was saying to me that to date that was his proudest piece of work, because you know what I loved about it. It actually, I mean, I grew up on a housing, you know, a sort of semi-detached housing estate. You know, not a high rise, not a low rise, but houses. And the estate that Neil by Mouth set in was a bit like the estate that I grew up in. It had flats and it had houses, and there was a certain beauty to it that Gary Oldman in that film, or the art director, managed to get across. And that kind of actually, you know, because a big hobby also of mine is that council houses are something used to be something to aspire to, right? They're something that can be these little utopias. And something in Neil by Mouth, even though the story behind it was a terrible story of abuse and violence and male on male horribleness and neglect and misogyny, there was this element in it that was beautiful, and I think that's very hard to pull off, and they did that there.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember the opening scene where he's ordering a drink, and that just said it all. It's just brilliant. I nailed it. You know what I mean?
Remember the joke? Remember the Jamie Foreman's joke about going to a swingers party and like?
No, I can't remember.
He tells this joke. He's at a swingers party. He goes back there and everyone's like, you know, daisy chaining it up, and he gets out halfway through and like starts rolling a joint. He goes, "Oh, hold on a minute, it's not one of those sort of parties."